Okay, so welcome everyone. We'll get started now. So what are we going to talk about today? So today we're going to talk about the realities of scaling supply chain decarbonisation. Obviously, this is a very important topic for all businesses right now, and it's also the theme of the show. So hopefully it fits in and it answers some of the questions that you've all been asking yourselves. And just before we get on, like, what qualifies us to sit here and talk about decarbonisation? I think that's a question that we may be asking ourselves. And the reason is we've been living this process for the last 2 years, year and a half, 2 years. So we've been engaged in a project that we'd like to talk to you about today. And what we'd really like you to understand from this presentation is when you go through this process, what you have to do, and also to share with you some of the learnings that we've found from this supply chain data, but also the actual project management. You know, what kind of things do you need to be aware of when you go through this process? So today we're going to talk about, we're going to tell you about our project, we're going to tell you what we did, how we did it. We're going to share some results with you, and we're going to tell you what we learned, what worked, what didn't work, and the kind of key takeaways there. And I think, you know, what we're going to give you now is one project. We are not saying that this is the only way to approach decarbonisation. This is just what we tried and kind of our learnings from that. So for those who don't know, I'm Katie Stevens. I'm leading the CSR and sustainability work at the European Outdoor Group. The European Outdoor Group is an industry association, so we are a club basically for brands, retailers, and all actors, stakeholders within the kind of outdoor and sports value chain. And I'll let Marcus introduce himself.
Thank you, Katie. My great pleasure to sit here with you today. I'm Marcus Wieser. I work in Gore Fabric's sustainability team, and I'm overlooking our carbon reduction program there. Before we start, let me probably ask you a question. So who agrees that we should be using as much recycled content, recycled fabrics, as possible to reduce our carbon footprint? Hands up, please. Who agrees we should be using as much recycled content as possible? Come on, guys, some hands here. I don't believe that. So I want to believe that everybody agrees that we should be using as much recycled content as possible. Now, but let me make a provocative statement. I think all of the organizations that you represent, the organization that I represent, we will be able to achieve our 2030 carbon goal by using virgin fabrics only. No whatsoever recycled content in our portfolio, and we will still meet our 2030 carbon goal. However, none of the organizations right here will meet their carbon goal if we don't manage to reduce our upstream supply chain emissions. Now, don't get me wrong, right? So I'm absolutely not arguing that we shouldn't be using recycled fabrics. We've been ramping up our product portfolio in that regard very significantly. I want to make the point that we must absolutely not overlook the impact of upstream supply chain decarbonization. In our case, speaking for Gore only, this is 10 times the impact what we can have with our materials. Right? Reducing upstream supply chain emissions is roughly 10 times the impact of what we can achieve with our materials. Okay, I hope this is getting you a little bit excited. Let's move on, Katie.
Thanks, Marcus. So we'll tell you about the project now, about what we've been doing. So I'm going to be honest, when we started this project, we had no idea what we were doing. We had a logo. We had a kind of vague idea of what we wanted to achieve. We knew that many of our brands were working in shared supply chains, and that was where we were. And I think this is quite an important point because, you know, there is no manual for this. There is no rule book, and it's scary and it's very daunting, but I think the key is just to start and figure it out as you go along. So we thought, you know, we wanted a collaborative approach. Obviously, we are working with lots of brands and retailers. And we wanted to kind of really leverage the shared supply chains that our members were working within. And then we got really lucky. A number of our members volunteered to take part in this project. We managed to persuade them. I don't know how we did it, but they all got on board and they all said they wanted to join in. And Yeah, so this is where we started. So the secondary aim of the project, the first aim was obviously to make some impact in the supply chains. But the secondary kind of goal of the project was to develop and test the methodology. So it was a very iterative process. There was a lot of kind of learning as we went along, and there were a lot of group decisions that were made within the group. And this is the brand story very much as it is our story. So that's why I'm very happy that Marcus is here to join us today to talk about how they got involved. So where did we start? So we started by speaking to a few people. We spoke to a few organizations. We identified a few potential stakeholders. And we just learned we just really learned a lot in the area. We knew that the first thing that we wanted to do was map the supply chains of the brands taking part in the project. So that's exactly what we did. We asked them for their top 15 Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. The reason we chose 15 was because we learned that a lot of the emissions are based in a very small proportion of the brand supply chains. So we thought we'd really start with that kind of top bit to see where we got. And this is what we saw. We expected a lot of overlap. So we had 10 brands and we had 15 suppliers. And there were 44 overlaps. We were genuinely quite surprised by how much overlap there was. We expected a little bit, but we absolutely didn't expect as much as we saw. One of the suppliers was shared by every single brand in the group, in the pilot group, which was very surprising. But the majority of them, they were shared between 2 or 3 brands. Yeah, when it came to distribution, there was... Can everyone see? Am I sat in front of the graph? When it came to distribution, a lot in Taiwan, a lot in China. Obviously, Vietnam also made up a large proportion, and then Korea, and then a few other countries. So the next process that we went through was a kind of pre-filtering stage. Pre-screening process. So we talked to the brands. We knew that 44 facilities were too many to start with, especially as we didn't really know what we were doing. So we wanted to filter it down a little bit. We did this by asking the brands to rate the facilities on their resources, on their internal capacity. We didn't want to start with facilities that had no internal capacity and couldn't do any of the work that we needed to do. Also commitment to projects that the brands were already working up with them on. We wanted to work with facilities who were fairly committed to sustainability and to projects in that area, and also around potential impact. And so the 44 facilities became 18, so we whittled it down, and the brands chose to focus on Taiwan and China. And the reason that they wanted to focus on these geographies is because they really wanted to focus on Tier 2, because we know that a lot of the impact is in the dyeing and the finishing processes. So we decided that for now, for the first stage, Tier 1 was out. We'd look at that later maybe. And for the first part of the pilot, we just wanted to focus on where a lot of impact is. The next phase that we went through was during the time when we were kind of asking around and talking to people, we came across the Carbon Leadership Programme, which I'll go into the detail of the Carbon Leadership Programme in a minute, but the Carbon Leadership Programme is managed by the Apparel Impact Institute, which is a sister organisation of HIG, and it works on the ground with Reset Carbon in the kind of geographies to carry out the day-to-day and the kind of one-to-one work. So the 18 facilities, the shared facilities that we'd ended up with, the 18 of them were all put through the Carbon Leadership Programme. And one other thing that I wanted to say was, it involved a lot of work and coordination. It's not, you don't just hand over a list of suppliers and it's all easily done. Obviously, working with a group, we had to decide who had the best relationship with the supplier, who was going to be the lead contact brand with those particular suppliers, and so on and so forth. So, just to clarify, this section is not an EOG program. This section that we're talking about here is the Carbon Leadership Program that is offered by AII and Reset Carbon. But what this program encompasses is the first step is a carbon tech assessment, And this is a online simple Excel questionnaire which kind of assesses the maturity of the facilities. And the results of the carbon tech assessment influence what process the facilities go through afterwards. So the 18 facilities went through the carbon tech assessment. There are so many acronyms. Anyone doing this, make sure you have a piece of paper to write them all down, because it can very quickly get quite overwhelming. So this was the CTA, carbon tech assessment. Out of the carbon tech assessment, the facilities are ranked by their maturity level, with type 3 being the most mature and type 1 being the least mature. For the type 3 facilities, they go on to, following the ranking and the maturity determination, the next step is the carbon reduction assessment. That's a CRA. And that is it's a process whereby they have either an online or an on-site carbon reduction based on how mature they are and what they understand about the process. Following this carbon reduction assessment, all of the facilities went through a process of capacity building. So this was a huge amount of workshops, and there were workshops on basic carbon management, introduction to toolkits and monitoring, and baseline development. There's a workshop around target planning and action plan development and so on. And there were also a number of classroom trainings on photovoltaic, metering, technology, fuel switch, boiler efficiency, so on and so forth. So all of the all of the 18 facilities went through this process. And a note here on how long this took. This took really a long time to get 18 facilities through this process. I think the carbon tech assessment took 3 months, 2 or 3 months, maybe longer, before we'd even really started, before we'd even really got to the point of doing anything. And I think going forward, there will be a much greater demand on service providers. So I think we were quite lucky because we got in quite early. But I think when we repeat this process, we might see even longer times to go through these kind of processes. Also, we were working through the back end of the pandemic, which also impacted some of the project because some on-site trainings couldn't take place and so on and so forth. So yeah, so unexpected things can crop up that you just don't expect. We also lost a few facilities along the way. We started with 18, and I think 16 made it to the carbon toolkit, which is the kind of output of the process. So what the carbon toolkit is it's a huge, very in-depth analysis that looks at all of their data, but it also provides a baseline, a target, and an action plan for those facilities. So we started with 18, we finished with 16, and the reason we lost facilities was firstly because the tools weren't suitable for one of the facility types, which obviously is a learning for us as an organisation, because obviously we need tools that work. So there was a learning there that we had to develop more tools. And we also lost a facility because they were engaged in other projects and it just wasn't the right time for them to go all the way. Now we have carbon toolkits for 15 of the 16 facilities. We're just waiting for the last one to arrive. So that's where we are in our project. So now on to what we've learned. So we've spent the last month or so. Are we good? We're good. Yeah, we've spent the last month or so really digging down into this data. And for anyone that likes data, we're now really onto the fun part. So all of the data that I'm going to share now is the aggregated data from the 15 carbon toolkits that we have. So this is the data from the 15 facilities that have gone through the process, and this provides, in my opinion, a really nice snapshot of the industry and of the suppliers that our members are working with. So the total emissions that we're talking about for 15 facilities is somewhere in the region of 500 million kilograms of CO2. That's 500 million kilograms, which is an awful lot. Just to clarify, this is from the 2021 data. I mean, it's a huge amount. Oh, I just licked the microphone. And then when we talk about where do these emissions come from? These emissions come predominantly from coal, which isn't a huge surprise, but also from purchased electricity, which comes from non-renewable sources. So I think we can fairly easily assume that that is also from coal. So if we look at the purchased electricity and the coal, I think that's 73%. So there's a huge learning for us there as an industry of where this heat is coming from for the industry. Also, there was some emissions from, natural gas, fuel oil, purchased steam, so on and so forth. But these are nowhere near as significant as what is coming from coal. Is there anything you want to add here, Marcus?
Maybe one comment. I don't know who of you is skiing. In case you do, have a look at the slopes and just imagine that every other jacket and pant you see on the slopes is being made with processes that are being fueled to some degree by coal. That's an interesting point of view to sort of, apply when you are skiing, right? But almost every single jacket or pant you see on the slopes is to do to some degree with coal. So while you said, Katie, no big surprise, to me actually, I'll be honest, this was a big surprise. And even in the purchased electricity down here, imagine that half of that or more in places like Taiwan and China is being generated by burning coal. So that's not finger pointing, that's just stating a fact, but that's stating a fact that, this is really something we need to work on collaboratively to get rid of. Otherwise, we just can't be successful in lowering our carbon footprint.
There's just one point that I forgot to make on this because I turned over too many pages at the same time. The maximum output here, the maximum emission was 133 million kilograms. The minimum was 154,000, which is the fifth one across, which is so small that you can't see it on the graph. And what I did was I took out the outliers. So I took out the two large ones and I took out the small one, and I worked out an average for the facilities, and it's around 20 million kilograms of CO2e per facility. And what about the actual, would you like to talk about this, Marcus? I think you were excited about this graph.
Yeah, so this one really got us excited because when we started our journey, really understanding carbon emissions holistically across our value chain in Gore, we were always making an assumption around potential upstream supply chain reductions in the area of 40 to 60%, right? So we were making an assumption, and we thought this would be fair because we are working to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions by some 60%. So we said if we sort of use the same lens to look at our upstream supply chain, that would be fair. This is the first ever data set that confirms that assumption. If you look at those dots on top of this graph, so those indicate that the suppliers we worked with are confident in achieving a 50 to 60% reduction of carbon footprint starting from 2016 all the way to 2030, right? And I think this is a really good number to sort of do ballpark calculations with. So you can assume for Taiwanese and Chinese supply chain probably a potential for supply chain carbon reduction in the area of 50 to 60%.
Thanks, Marcus. And just, sorry, I forgot to explain the graph at the beginning. So on the left axis, we've got the sum of emissions, which is the bars. So it's the data from the previous graph, but the baseline year. And then on the right, we have the potential reductions in percent. So the diamonds at the top are the potential reduction percentages. And the next graph is showing what mitigation actions could potentially deliver the greatest impact, the greatest emission savings. So 19% is switching to renewable energy. 62% is fairly significant, which is the thermal fuel switch. So on the renewable energy electricity, that could be projects like increased proportion of green electricity in factories and increase off-site green electricity procurement. With the thermal fuel switch, so the 62%, that could be projects such as coal phase-out, boiler fuel replacement. The next one is operational management and maintenance, which is 5.6%. And examples of projects that could achieve that are things like improving boiler efficiency or flue gas waste heat recovery. The next 7.7% is technology retrofit, which could be things like water pump with frequency converter or steam valve installation. And then the smallest ones are mitigation actions such as changing transportation or water projects. So from this, we have a fairly good idea of, within those 15 facilities, what kind of mitigation actions will actually drive big impact in terms of reduction. The next graph I want to share is, it shows, so for each facility within the carbon toolkit, you get a huge amount of mitigation actions that the facilities can discuss, whether they want to implement them or not, so on and so forth. And what this graph shows is, of those 15 facilities, what percentage of those 15 facilities had the recommended mitigation actions. So 74% had renewable energy switches, 35% had thermal fuel switches, and so on and so forth. So we've seen kind of how much impact we can drive and what kind of projects will drive that impact. And the next slide was, for me, the one that was really interesting. The next slide shows the willingness of the suppliers to implement those actions. And I only actually put this slide together last night, and I was so happy and really quite surprised to see how willing suppliers are to implement change. So, I mean, pretty much everything is above 70%. So, you know, there's a real willingness from the supply base to actually bring in the measures that are needed. Any comments on that, Marcus?
Yeah, I really don't want to pour some water into your wine, but here's some. So that's a great picture, right? So this is showing, as you say, the willingness. What we didn't get in the project is a very clear indication with regards to what is the investments it would take to get there. What is the return on investment to make these projects work? And that's a critical piece going from intention to actual execution. And that is something we need to follow up on in the next step. But I totally echo what you said, Katie. We were surprised and pleased to see that super high level of commitment.
So now, so I think we've given a really nice overview of, you know, where the suppliers, some of the suppliers are. I think that's really nice. Now on to the learnings. And I think there's kind of two aspects to the learnings that we've learned through this project. The first is around things like, you know, how long it takes, how much it costs, how necessary good supplier relations are. And then the other kind of group of learnings are around, you know, what have we learned about the actual carbon picture? So Marcus is going to talk us through some of the learnings.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah. So first learning. If you look at that chart over here, the blue bars show you the absolute emissions for one exemplary supplier from 2016 to 2021. And what you can see is the absolute emissions are not coming down. That's pretty sad, right? Because we all know emissions need to come down. What is coming down, though, is the intensity, meaning the kilos of CO2 emitted per kilo material made or per meter fabric made, which is great. The problem, and that's really an industry problem that's relevant for each and every one of us, is that the increasing volumes that we all together have been shipping overcompensated the intensity improvement, right? So since we've been shipping more, even though we've brought the intensity, the kilogram of CO2 per meter fabric made, we've brought that down. The volume has gone up, which has overcompensated that effect. And that is something we don't have a solution for, but this is clearly a big challenge for the whole industry. So that's takeaway number one. And this picture was fairly consistent across most of the suppliers, right? Learning number two, and Katie, you already alluded to that, 2/3 of the reduction potential relates to phasing out coal and switching to renewable electricity. Phasing out coal, right? I mean, that's a super simple concept to understand, but it's so hard to execute on. This requires really big investments, so there is very serious capex involved there. But that's something we have to make work. And the second option is switch to renewable electricity. Now think about a region like Taiwan. There is probably something like 10% of renewable electricity in the grid. That's significantly less than, for instance, in Europe, right? So it's not simple for any other supplier to just switch their electricity supply to renewable electricity supply. And since, for instance, I'm looking at Taiwan now, you know there is so much semiconductor industry in Taiwan. Whenever there is a new offshore wind park being built, it's usually being sucked up by the semiconductor industry. So this is again a call to the industry to work together with our supply base in Taiwan to make sure that we can increase the supply of renewable electricity so that this is a product that is accessible, which currently it isn't. That's another learning here. And then the last learning on that slide, which really was a nice surprise for us, is that you know what, I guess you know what science-based targets are. This is sort of the level of ambition you should set yourself when you want your climate goals to align with climate science. And most of the suppliers really showed the potential and willingness and commitment to align to this really ambitious level of carbon reductions. So that was another really nice learning in the process. Anything you want to add?
I think from my side, something around, I think as EOG, we have been quite very impressed by the level of collaboration between the brands, but we've also seen how much value that brings. You know, this is not just about this is about sharing costs, but this is not just about sharing costs. All of the brands bring knowledge and experience and supplier relationships to the table. And I think this process, if we'd have been working with fewer brands, it would have been a lot different. So I think the need for collaboration on this has been quite astounding for us.
So the next slide really talks about how we work with our suppliers and what we learn from our suppliers. All of us, we are so much trained to talk about and think about products and materials, right? What we are less trained to is engage with our suppliers on, you know, coal phase out, what we just explained, or switching to renewable electricity. But that's the conversations we also need to have. And what we found is that our suppliers are more than willing to go there. That was really, I'm repeating myself, right? But this was really a nice finding. So on the right-hand side, you can see a simple survey we did with questions like, the carbon reduction target in the carbon leadership program is clear and understandable. And you see that our suppliers rated this very highly. On a scale from 1 to 7, we saw this come out at 6.4. Or the last one, the effort to complete the toolkit is acceptable. Suppliers said on a scale from 1 to 7, that's at 6.2, which was really nice, right? And you can also see that the distribution was very even. So a couple of additional learnings there. Scalability, that's an important one, right? So this was a pilot project. We were working with, as you said, 16 suppliers, but the ambition is really to take it to our full supply basis, and that's many more suppliers. Scalability at this point in time is limited, and it's limited by the number of service providers on the ground. Katie explained that we were working with a company called Reset Carbon, and they did a fantastic job. But even they were constrained by the numbers of engineers that they had on the ground to engage with our suppliers. So that's a bottleneck we have to overcome before we can scale this. And then another fairly big issue that we still need to find a solution for is that many of you will be using HIG tools to work with suppliers and understand footprints and understand facility footprints. And even though this program was born out of, let's say, the SAC universe, Sustainable Apparel Coalition universe, Sustainable Apparel Coalition owning the HIG tools, this is not yet living in the HIG suite of tools. So we were deploying, and AII, the Apparel Impact Institute, were deploying an additional set, an alternative set of tools to work with our suppliers. And we feel that this is not a winning case going forward, because we can only ask the same question to our suppliers once, but we can't ask them to report energy consumptions to two different set of tools. So this is clearly a limitation to scalability at this point in time. Yeah, and then maybe one last one to finish up on the learnings is really, there were a lot of findings that were really new for us and that help us to look at this issue in a very different way. The one thing we don't yet understand sufficiently enough is the level of investment required to make these interventions and to make these measures happen. Right? So that is something that we still need to understand. And that's not hundreds of thousands of euros or dollars. That's absolutely in the 7-digit millions of dollars or euros range. Any other learnings?
I don't think so. I think we've covered everything there. So that's what we learned. And it was a very steep learning curve, I'd say. I think we had to learn quite quickly. But next steps. So what are we doing next as EOG and as the project, and kind of what happens next? So I think we've got our methodology fairly well sorted out now. We seem to know what we're doing. So the next stages for our pilot group are stages 4 and 5. So in stage 4, it'll be around implementation of the recommended mitigation actions that we need to carry out. And this will require a kind of collaborative approach, again, with AII and Reset Carbon to provide that support for the suppliers. I think one thing we've learned is this is all about supporting each other, supporting up and down and across. You know, we need to support the suppliers through these processes, but we need to support the industry sideways as well. So the implementation will begin, and AII and HIG are in the process of developing a online tracking tool to kind of work with the suppliers further to make sure that the implementation actions are going ahead. So that's what's next for the pilot group. In terms of what's next for the EOG and kind of our work on this topic, the first thing we're going to do is continue to stage 5 with the pilot group, so all the way that we just showed on the previous slide. We've also started a second cohort. Now that we have a methodology and we know who the stakeholders are and we kind of have a rough idea of what we need to do, we're starting a second cohort with a number of other organisations. We also want to collaborate with other stakeholders and also look at other product groups. So far we've only been focusing on apparel. Obviously we had to start somewhere, but now we're asking, you know, what does this mean for footwear and what does this mean for hard goods? Obviously, footwear and hard goods operate in quite different supply chains and use very different materials. So how can we replicate this in kind of semi-different sectors? And we want to engage interested organisations. If you're a brand in this, I think we've got 20 facilities going through with the second cohort. So, you know, that's nearly 40 facilities. So I think if you're a brand in this room, the likelihood is that we are working with the facilities that you're working with. So there's an email address at the end, so do get in touch. Even the facilities that have already got to the carbon toolkit stage, there's still opportunities to engage and to get involved. You know, any support we may need with mitigation actions. You know, the pilot group is very much not over. It's very much ongoing. And we also want to develop an impact acceleration fund at the EOG. So a question that we've come back to so many times through this pilot group is, how are we going to pay for this? You know, we're not talking about small scales of money, as Marcus explained. As an indication for the pilot project, so we had 10 brands, we had 16 facilities, 16 facilities, and I think so far we've spent somewhere in the region of 150,000 euros, which is not insignificant at all. Obviously, the costs have been shared between 10 brands, so per brand it's much more manageable. So I think we're very aware of the high costs that are needed to actually get through that implementation stage. So it comes back to the question, you know, we know that we are going to need significant resource to meet the necessary climate targets by 2050 and also by 2030. While all of this was going on, there was a report released by AII and I think Fashion for Good, and they said to decarbonise the fashion industry, it's going to require just over $1 trillion, which is huge amounts of money. Obviously, sport and outdoor is smaller, so we'll be a smaller proportion of that, but we're talking we're starting at 6 zeros. So it became clear that normal CSR budgets are not going to achieve what we need to achieve here. Current approaches will be limited, and we need to find a way to scale the work quickly. We need to find a way to finance this. And then we had a bit of a light bulb moment. So one of our members, so Autovox, reached out to us, and they said they have this lovely way of generating fund for philanthropic good. So what they do is, for every sale that is made online, direct to consumer, that is not returned, they put €3 in a pot. So they have this pot growing, and they spend that, and they said, they budget that in for the return, to cover the return cost, and they communicate at point of sale, and they make that donation for every product that is not returned. And they said that, ironically, the money that they generate from this is considerably larger than their CSR budget every year. So we were wondering how we could, maybe find a way to kind of manage that and maybe tap into it a little bit. So we had this idea, we know the outdoor industry does great things together. We've got organisations like IOCA who are pouring money into conservation. We've got organisations like the It's Great Out There coalition who are really focusing on activation and how to get Europe active. So we thought, why can't we start some kind of fund that looks at kind of insetting, that looks at the mitigation actions that need to be made very, very quickly. So we got some, too fast. So we got some great brains together. We got the pilot group, we all got together, and we talked about, what an impact acceleration fund could look like. How could we raise money? How could we decide which projects got funded? So on and so forth. And we just had a great time kind of pulling all of these ideas together. So what we're proposing is the Impact Acceleration Fund. For now, it's concentrating only on climate. This will be the topic of the fund for the coming years. Maybe when we've finished that, we'll move on to something else, but for now, it's definitely a priority topic. And it's basically a collaborative fund dedicated to supporting decarbonisation projects and climate mitigation actions within supply chains related to the outdoor industry. So, sorry about all these papers, by the way. So we're kind of thinking around, what kind of projects could be funded. We think things like clean replacement of energy, coal phase out, so on and so forth. Maybe when we've finished the decarbonisation, we move on to kind of offsetting and we look at collaborative offsetting projects. We don't know. But we are very aware that every actor within the supply chain has a responsibility to address this. The brands have a responsibility. The retailers have a responsibility. So far, what we see in a lot of cases with retail is that they are making quite strict demands, but there's very little support for the brands in the work that they have to go through. And actually, I feel personally that retailers should be contributing towards this decarbonisation efforts. There could also be opportunities for consumers to contribute through things like there are services that make donations on online payments, so on and so forth. Also things like 1% for the planet. We're applying for this to be a 1% for the planet project. So any organisations who are contributing to 1% for the planet could nominate this fund as their 1% for the planet project. But the idea is quite simple. It's about raising money and pouring that back into the industry, into the work that we need to do. So final thoughts. So Marcus and I discussed earlier in the week how we finish this presentation, how we end. And I think what we decided is we'd have some requests for you, like where do we want to see the industry in a few years? And I think what we would like to see, what we need to see going forward, is a solid understanding of emissions, but also a willingness to support partners. This is everyone's problem. This is everyone's challenge. And we cannot manage this alone. And we'd like to also look at some kind of industry lighthouse project. Could we be responsible for developing some kind of solar park in Taiwan, or something outside of the normal projects that we talk about day to day? Any thoughts from your side, Marcus? No.
No, thank you.
So that's what we've been doing. This is where we are. This is what we've learned. If you have any questions, please email my colleague Verity. She'd be very happy to receive your questions, your comments, your thoughts. And if anyone wants to get involved in the projects or to find out which suppliers we've been working with and which suppliers have carbon toolkits, email Verity. Thank you, everybody.
And we're very happy to also take questions now, of course.
Can I ask you all initially to show your appreciation for the detail? If you struggled to keep up with it, so did I. But they have made it so much easier to understand than the first time I heard it. So thank you for...
Was it confusing?
Initially, yeah. My mind was blown, and I'm meant to know about this stuff. But by the end, I really got hold of it, I've got to say. So thank you for that. Okay. But not only have they explained it in a clearer way, but they're actually doing it, which is the most important thing. So I'm filling for, if there are any questions, we have some philosophical questions which have come in virtually. Felix, I hope you're taking note of the email address there, because they might be better answered by emailing Verity directly. But are there any questions from the audience that we want to take on? Okay, Katie, Marcus, whole series of philosophical questions to challenge you.
Okay.
300 million tons of CO2 emissions are equivalent to the construction of 1,000 to 1,200 wind turbines that would be necessary to replace one nuclear power plant. Comment. If we want to truly reduce the CO2 emissions over the next 20 years, why would we produce wind turbines that emit 300 million tons of CO2? Absolute emissions cannot come down because we are producing hundreds of thousands of wind turbines. Wind turbines and solar panels are carbonisation due to production of these energy forms. So how do you want to decarbonise? They are more philosophical questions to me, that when you look at the whole question...
I mean, I do have a comment on this, actually, because this is something that I've been reading a lot lately, and everyone's like, oh, it's going to cost trillions to decarbonise. But the point is, to find more coal and more oil, we still have to spend money, and nobody is using those numbers in the calculation. Everyone is only focusing on what development costs without actually comparing that against what the status quo costs. Obviously, you know, there are costs involved with finding new oil fields, there are costs involved with building new oil rigs, but nobody is weighing that up in the calculations. So it doesn't answer the question, but it is something that's been annoying me lately.
And yes, that's a philosophical question, well beyond our remit. But I think I want to believe in taking this forward, what we've created. I'm very optimistic that we'll be working with the best regional partners we can work with, for instance, in Taiwan, to help us find out which the most suitable options are. And you know, who am I to say, you know, this generation method or that generation method? I think it's really for the local partners that have the best view on what's going on in these regions to help us with those solutions.
Yeah. And I mean, another comment on nuclear as well. I read an article this week about they've been testing the DNA of animals around Chernobyl, and the DNA is actually changing. So I think, you know, relying on nuclear, it's not a long-term solution, is it?
Well, from my point of view, you guys know I work in a design school, and I seriously believe that if we do not iterate, if we do not experiment, if we do not try to do something differently, we're just compounding the bad. We know when we iterate, we will get more wrong than we get right. But actually, I'm really proud of this industry we work in, because people like you are doing it. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's a solution.
Oh, it is perfect,
but you've got off your butt and you're doing it. And collectively, we need to do more of that. So your appeal is for more people to join in the project.
Absolutely. I mean, literally the more the merrier. The more people who are involved in this process, the more people who collaborate. It reduces the costs immediately, but it just gets it's just better. More brains equals more betterness.
But I'm still scanning, no hands.
No
Nobody
questions.
wants to challenge them. In which case, can I ask you all to show your appreciation for Marcus and Katie, please?
Out of interest, how many brands are here? And how many suppliers? Technology brands? And what else do we have? Who's everyone else? Okay, I mean, yeah.
Thank you so much for stopping by. Much appreciated.
We're going to take a 10-minute comfort break again. We're going to come back and we're going to be talking one of those subjects which has become very popular, biodegradability. Is it the solution to everything? The more I look into it, the more I know there's something brilliant in biodegradability, but it's not giving us the answer that we think it's at yet. This is going to be a paper on the future of biodegradability. So about 12 minutes time, we're going to start back up.